Hi folks, just a heads up, this is the second episode in a two-part episode about Martin McGuinness, so I highly recommend you go back and listen to the first part before you tune into this one. Thanks. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast about the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. So where were we? The hunger strikes had just finished, and the paramilitaries realised that there would be a path forward in the political sphere, which saw Martin McGuinness elected to the Northern Irish Assembly in 1982. Willie Carlin, who was a provisional IRA member turned British agent, would drive Martin McGuinness around on occasion and spoke of his election.
When I look back now, obviously he was the man that was going to represent the IRA. The IRA didn't want anybody getting elected that wouldn't work for them. But we had to take him out and get him a tie and get him a jacket, and then he wore that bloody jacket for about 6 years.
As McGuinness did not recognise the British government, he did not take a seat, as was the stance of all Sinn Féin politicians at the time. In 1983, McGuinness faced off against the SDLP's John Hume. The SDLP were a non-violent nationalist party who abhorred the violence being doled out by the Provisionals. McGuinness believed that they were not getting anything done and challenged Hume to a public debate about the cause of violence in Ireland. Hume responded saying, quote, "There is nothing new about the Provisionals. They have filled the graveyards, the jails and the dole queues. Their target has been the destruction of the economy, and Sinn Féin is now trying to exploit that. The contradiction is an insult to the electorate's intelligence." This statement angered McGuinness, who fired back, saying, quote, "It's very easy for people to put the blame on the shoulder of the IRA. I think the people who do that are making a very serious mistake and are failing to understand the sensitivities of people who feel very strongly and are very angry about what the British government has done here." This was the same year where relations between Sinn Féin and the INLA broke down, with Sinn Féin condemning a no-warning car bomb attack that the INLA had carried out in a residential area. But on that same day, the IRA had also carried out a no-warning car bomb elsewhere, so the condemnation was not taken very seriously by the INLA. There was a risk of an outbreak of violence between the two groups, but this was avoided for the most part. By the mid-1980s, McGuinness was determined to continue building his profile as a politician, but his paramilitary life was never far behind. In the wake of Sinn Féin winning an increasing number of seats at the local elections, McGuinness still felt that Sinn Féin had a secondary role to that of the IRA. In his own words,
"We don't believe that winning elections and winning any amount of votes will bring freedom in Ireland. At the end of the day, it will be the cutting edge of the IRA which will bring freedom."
There were many times in McGuinness's life where he would unknowingly work alongside informers or agents. But it's the story of Frank Hegarty which exemplifies just how ruthless he could be to those who betrayed him. Frank Hegarty was originally with the official IRA when he was approached by military intelligence in 1977. In early 1984, Hegarty reached back out to intelligence, saying that Martin McGuinness had approached him and asked him to store some guns. Instead of seizing the guns, which would instantly draw suspicion on Hegarty, they were all tagged so that they would be identifiable if used in future attacks. McGuinness then contacted Hegarty asking for a rifle to use in an attack on a British soldier. This was allowed so as not to blow his cover, and the rifle was eventually found to have been used in 2 killings. McGuinness then entrusted Hegarty with finding locations to store weapons which had arrived from Libya, all along the Northern Irish border. This was a strange relationship between the two, because other Republicans had actually warned McGuinness that Hegarty was an informer as far back as 1977, but he appeared to ignore their warnings. Hegarty told his handlers of the dumps, which were all on the Republic of Ireland's side. This made things difficult for British intelligence. They informed the Gardaí, who lifted the weapons on January 26, 1984. The night of the arms raid, Hegarty got a call from his handler and was told he had to be picked up immediately his cover was blown. Frank was annoyed as he wanted to stay in Derry with his mother, but he was relocated to Kent in England instead for his own safety. He believed that he could return to Derry though, but McGuinness by this stage had a very dim view of informers. The admissions of Supergrass Raymond Gilmore years before had taken many Derry provisionals off the streets for months and months. The internal security unit of the IRA had been set up to combat these informants and agents. Anyone suspected of being an informer would be subjected to a brutal interrogation. If they admitted to being an informer, this admission would be recorded on a tape recorder and given to the family, and the informer would then be executed with their body dumped on the side of the road, sometimes with cash placed in their hands. The man in charge of this unit was a man by the name of Freddie Scappaticci, aka Steak Knife. And unbeknownst to McGuinness, he was the British Army's most important agent throughout the Troubles. In an effort to get Hegarty to return back to Derry, McGuinness befriended his mother Rose, and would regularly visit her in her home and have a chat with her. He convinced Rose to let him speak on the phone to Hegarty. McGuinness told him that if he came back to Derry he would be safe. That was enough for Frank, who left Kent and returned home. Initially, his family hid him upstairs in his home for 4 days as they didn't trust McGuinness. But after many discussions, Frank eventually signed an affidavit pledging to never give evidence against McGuinness, and he believed that he would be okay. But just to tie all the loose ends up, McGuinness said that he needed to drive him across the border to Donegal, so he could clear things up with the Provisional IRA. Frank willingly went with him, and his body was found dumped on the side of a lane with 2 bullets in his head. Here's Frank's mother Rose talking about Martin McGuinness on the Cook Report.
I feel very bitter now and full of regrets that I ever let him in the door. That's how I feel. That I ever let him come in my door. Such an evil man. He got out and said to me on his knees, "There's nothing going to happen to Frank. I'll bring him back." Suppose they done with him what they done with every other body. They threw it in the road like a dog. His body.
McGuinness later denied making any assurances of Frank's safety to Rose, and described the Cook Report as total and absolute rubbish. It does appear he did something similar in the case of Willie Carlin, who I mentioned earlier. When Carlin had to flee Northern Ireland after word came that Scappaticci was coming for him, McGuinness visited the home of his wife and explained to her that he should come home and this will be all figured out. Carlin stayed away, and he stayed alive. In 1988, we had one of the darkest chain reactions of the entire Troubles. 3 IRA members were killed while planning a car bomb attack in Gibraltar. Their bodies were returned to Ireland, and on the 16th of March, their funeral took place in Milltown Cemetery in Belfast. McGuinness attended this funeral, and he was the main target of freelance loyalist Michael Stone. On the morning of the funeral, Stone stuffed some grenades into his pocket and brought a gun with him. As he arrived at the graveyard, he believed that he had a clear shot at Gerry Adams, but he wanted to wait for Martin McGuinness. As one of the bodies was lowered into the ground, Stone flung 2 grenades into the mourners. His intention was to scatter the crowd, so he could get a clear shot at McGuinness, but upon the detonation of the grenades, McGuinness dived behind a tombstone. Stone continued shooting and throwing grenades and fled towards the nearest motorway, where he was arrested by the RUC. There is no doubt, if not for his arrest, Stone would have been killed by the crowd. Stone killed 3 people in this attack. 2 days later, at the funeral for the man killed in the graveyard, 2 soldiers accidentally drove into his funeral cortege. The mourners feared that they were under attack again, and the men were pulled out of their car and executed, more or less in broad daylight. These were indeed dark times. That same year, the Catholic Church brought John Hume together with Gerry Adams to work on an overall strategy to establish peace and justice in Ireland, with the Irish Taoiseach Charles Haughey being updated on the process. These were difficult times for John Hume, as he and his family often faced criticism in Derry when they called out the Provisional IRA violence, and his house was attacked numerous times. McGuinness was aware of these talks, but was not involved. He had no interest in a ceasefire. saying at an Easter commemoration that year, quote, "The IRA position on ceasefires has been on record for a long time. No more ceasefires. Talk can take place, but the war will go on." He continued saying that the IRA's plan was to demoralise and sap the political will of the British government by means of limited guerrilla warfare against Crown forces. He continued to be critical of SDLP and their non-violence, calling them the linchpin of British government strategy. If you look at Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness during this time, both were prominent politicians in Sinn Féin with links to the Provisional IRA. We know Martin McGuinness was still in a leadership role in the Provisional IRA, and whereas Gerry Adams was coming around to a political resolution, McGuinness was very much in favour of continuing with violence to wear down the British resolve. McGuinness started to widen the net of those who were considered a legitimate target for the Provisional IRA. So instead of only targeting British soldiers and members of the security services, now you could be targeted if you serviced British military vehicles or worked as a caterer in an army barracks. Such was the case of Patsy Gillespie, who worked as a cleaner at Fort George Army Base. He was abducted from his home, chained to a van full of explosives, and forced to drive it to a security checkpoint before it was remotely detonated. This method was described as a proxy bomb or human bomb attack, and it is believed that these human bomb attacks were sanctioned by McGuinness himself. The largest part of Patsy ever recovered was his hand. But though McGuinness seemed unrepentant about his wanting to continue with violence, he was well aware of the pressure to make peace, and in the early 90s he began to show hints that he was ready to give up the provisionals and step fully into politics. Their mortal enemy, Margaret Thatcher, was gone, and John Major replaced her as the new Prime Minister, and he seemed more amenable to discourse with the IRA. Throughout his life, Martin McGuinness faced many accusations that he was being protected by British intelligence, or that he was informing on other provisionals. I haven't found any truth to these claims, but what is true is that Martin McGuinness became a sort of a back channel for talks between British intelligence, the British government, and republicanism. So while there were public talks taking place, paving the road for peace, these secret back channels between the British government and the provisionals were equally as important. In this way, it was in the British government's best interest to keep him around, and this fact may have saved him from being arrested on a number of occasions. The best example of this was Operation Taurus, which was a planned prosecution against him by the RUC. It was called off as it was deemed not in the public interest, even though there were a number of people willing to act as witnesses against him. Perhaps the British government thought that he was important because they could negotiate with him. Arrest him, and who takes his place? 1993 was a turning point for peace, and on February 22nd, the British government received a startling message with the name Martin McGuinness attached. The message read, quote, "The conflict is over, but we need your advice on how to bring it to a close. We wish to have an unannounced ceasefire in order to hold a dialogue leading to peace. We cannot announce such a move as it will lead to confusion to the volunteers, because the press will misinterpret it as a surrender. We cannot meet the Secretary of State's public renunciation of violence, but it would be given privately as long as we were sure that we were not being tricked." This message was taken very seriously by the British, but it wasn't actually from Martin McGuinness. It would appear that this message was more of an intelligence assessment of the IRA's position, which was intentionally designed to look like it was from McGuinness's mouth himself, in the hope that it would jumpstart peace talks. On December 15th, 1993, Irish Taoiseach Albert Reynolds and the British Prime Minister John Major issued what has become known as the Downing Street Declaration. The declaration affirmed both the right of the people of Ireland to self-determination and that Northern Ireland would be transferred to the Republic of Ireland from the United Kingdom only if a majority of its population was in favour of such a move. In the wake of the Downing Street Declaration, McGuinness and Adams got to work, trying to convince the rest of the Republican movement to come around to the idea of an end to their armed campaign, while also continuing to get assurances from London and Dublin that their demands would be met. This was not an easy task. The hawks in the Republican movement saw peace coming, but felt like their military campaign, their hunger strikes, their years in prison, was all for nothing if Northern Ireland was still a part of the United Kingdom. This would eventually lead to the starting of a new paramilitary group, the real IRA, by some of those disillusioned members. On August 31st, 1994, the Provisional IRA announced a complete cessation of military operations. They were deliberate in their wording and avoided using the word permanent. McGuinness had to convince his fellow paramilitaries that the Republican struggle had not been abandoned. This ceasefire paved the way for peace talks, but McGuinness was firm, saying that it was a ceasefire that was conditional on a successful outcome from the negotiations, which saw him, in December, arriving at Stormont in Belfast to begin the talks. This was a big deal for McGuinness. Speaking of this moment, he said, quote, "When I stood on the steps of Stormont looking down the grand avenue that leads to Newtownards Road, I felt that we had taken ownership for the first time of the place, and we had arrived politically, and that we could build a new Ireland."
It was an empty building, but I think it was a real sense of occasion. I think that we knew that this was a path that we would have to go down. But I think that that began a process which has brought us to where we are today.
McGuinness fit in well at Stormont. Quote, "Martin struck us as a formidable person, sharp and impressive all round. He impressed people by his presence, without having to say much or issue any threats. And of course, he could be quite tough." Decommissioning was one of the main talking points. If the IRA wanted people to trust their ceasefire, then they must put their weapons beyond use. This is something that was very difficult to get across the line, and the British government insisted that for Sinn Féin to be present at the talks, the Provisional IRA would need to decommission their weapons. This IRA ceasefire lasted 17 months, and during that time, they continued to stockpile and store weapons and bombs. Then on February 9th, 1996, they broke their ceasefire by detonating a massive bomb at the Docklands in London. On the day of the bombing, they released a statement which read, quote, "As we stated on August 31st, 1994, the basis for the cessation was to enhance the democratic peace process and underline our definitive commitment to its success. Instead of embracing the peace process, the British government acted in bad faith, with Mr. Major and the Unionist leaders squandering this unprecedented opportunity to resolve the conflict. Time and time again over the last 18 months, selfish party political and sectional interests in the London Parliament have been placed before the rights of the people of Ireland. The blame for the failure thus far of the Irish peace process lies squarely with John Major and his government." It would appear that shortly before the Docklands bomb, McGuinness resigned from his role on the Army Council to continue trying to put more distance away from his paramilitary life. 2 weeks after the Docklands bombing, British Prime Minister John Major announced that all party peace talks would resume, and the stipulation that the IRA must decommission their weapons was dropped. Critics of the IRA claimed that they successfully bombed their way back to the negotiating table, but it does seem that all sides were determined to find a resolution. McGuinness was Sinn Féin's chief negotiator during the peace talks, which went on to lead to the Good Friday Agreement, which was signed on April 10th, 1998. Here's McGuinness talking about arriving back in Derry and having the faith of the people of Derry behind him.
I remember the night of Good Friday going back to Derry City, and the next day meeting someone just by chance who was very much a part of the struggle, person who had been imprisoned. It was a woman, and I asked her what she thought about the agreement, and she said no. She said, "What do you think about the agreement?" And I said, "Well, I think we've got a good deal, and I think we can build on it." And she said, "Well, that's good enough for me."
In 1997, McGuinness was elected MP for Mid-Ulster. All Northern Irish MPs also have the right to sit in the House of Commons in Westminster, but he adhered to Sinn Féin's policy of abstentionism, refusing to sit in the House of Commons or swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen. there was an interesting story about Martin McGuinness in Westminster that I came across. On a visit to London, he was told that even though he refused to sit in the House of Commons, he may be able to avail of privileges that come with being an MP. He would be entitled to an office space in the government building. This meant that he could get 24-hour access to the House of Commons without having to be searched. He would also have access to the many facilities there, including the firing range. He and Gerry Adams planned on hiring Siobhan O'Hanlon as the office manager there. She was a former IRA bomber who escaped an SAS ambush in Gibraltar. English politicians were appalled at the prospect of this. Some of them were still under police guard as a result of IRA threats on their life, with one of them saying, quote, "I would be horrified to bump into IRA members in the bars and restaurants of the House." To combat this, new regulations were introduced, saying that you could only access the House of Commons if you took your seat in Westminster, something which McGuinness refused to do. Back in Northern Ireland, McGuinness continued to work in the political sphere. It's undeniable that in the past he got his hands dirty, and it was something that unionist politicians had a hard time ever getting around. They were now being forced to work alongside a man who had ordered the killings of their friends, family and colleagues. The two unionist parties, the UUP and the DUP, never quite forgot this, and it was a topic which would come up time and time again. Here's a clip from BBC's Newsnight, where UUP politician Ken McGuinness spoke with Martin McGuinness, calling him the godfather of the IRA.
One of the responsibilities I have is to find out exactly what Martin McGuinness and the IRA wants. The IRA is going to come to the table. If they're coming with their guns and with the threat of further violence, then of course there can be no progress.
But you will be at the table, will you? Will be at the table.
Well, that remains to be seen. We're certainly not going to sit at the table with terrorists. At the moment, as far as I'm concerned, Martin McGuinness is the godfather of godfathers of the IRA.
In which case you are sitting at a table with somebody you would define as a terrorist. I'm simply trying to ask, what's the difference between sitting down tonight in a TV studio where you're obviously confident of your position and you can put it with authority, and sitting down next month and doing the same thing?
Quite simply that I felt for a considerable length of time, and it had nothing to do with South Africa. I wasn't there, nor indeed is the South African situation comparable to ours. But I felt that it was wrong to let the IRA come on the airwaves unchallenged. And now there are enough people who agree with me to enable me to come here. But can I say this? That we have got to find out. Here is Martin McGuinness, who in 1972 was flown by William Whitelaw, the then Secretary of State, to Cheney Walk to discuss with the United Kingdom government the way forward. He rejected, at that particular time, peace talks. At that time, the IRA had killed 238 people. He rejected any peace talks at that time, and since then, the IRA have killed another 1,966 people in Northern Ireland. Now, Martin McGuinness has presided over those killings. In fact, he has directly sanctioned some of those killings. I cannot...
Again, these are obviously very serious allegations, which I'd like to give Martin McGuinness an opportunity to respond to before we move on.
Well, I reject absolutely what Ken McGuinness has said. The only thing I've ever been convicted of within this state was, when I was 19 years of age, was an altercation with a British soldier in the Strand Road in Derry, for which I was fined £50.
And you were sentenced to 6 months in jail in the Irish Republic in 1973 for membership of the IRA.
That's correct.
And a year in 1974 for membership of the IRA. Yeah. And he became officer commanding Northern Command in 1976. And he became the Chief of Staff in 1979.
Well, I've already rejected those allegations.
In 1999, Martin McGuinness was appointed Education Minister in the Northern Irish Assembly. Up until a few months before, he was still the head of the IRA's Northern Command. Here's the footage of Gerry Adams nominating him, and you can hear an audible gasp and hissing from angry politicians in the chamber.
Mr. Adams.
I name Martin McGuinness, Martin McGuinness, Mar Ira Atticus. I nominate Martin McGuinness as Minister for Education.
Will Mr. Martin McGuinness confirm that he is willing to take up office. Order! Order!
There were also demonstrations against this appointment by victims' groups. But these ultimately faded away, and McGuinness proved to be a competent minister. But decommissioning was still a sticking point. The deadline for the Provisional IRA was May 11th, 2000, and by the time that arrived, they still had not disarmed. The new government, with Unionists and Nationalists leading side by side, began on December 2nd, 1999, and then was suspended in February 2000 because decommissioning still had not occurred. The peace process was on the brink of collapse. Here's a visibly upset McGuinness speaking to reporters.
It's been absolutely gut-wrenching for me as an Irish Republican to come to this building, storm it, and be a minister in a Northern Executive.
Eventually, in April 2002, the Provisional IRA announced that they'd put their weapons beyond use, and by 2005, they formally announced an end to the 36-year-long armed campaign. In response to this, the British military deployment ended on the 31st of July 2007. So was it a happy ending? Not at all. Unionists found it very difficult to accept men of violence in the world of politics. Many of the key Unionist politicians may have stoked the flames of violence, but weren't directly involved themselves. Here's the DUP's Gregory Campbell speaking of McGuinness.
He's trying to present to people an image of a reformed character, that he does now want to reach out and offer a new, vibrant future for all of us. And of course, it's nonsense, absolute and utter nonsense. He's engaged for 30 years in trying to murder us into United Ireland. That hasn't worked, so he simply adopts a different tactic.
And politically, working side by side together proved very difficult. When one side was unhappy, they could collapse the entire government, which happened many times. Since its establishment in 1999, the Northern Irish Assembly has collapsed at different intervals, amounting to around 10 years of inactivity. There were allegations of Sinn Féin spying, then a scandal involving the DUP, then most recently a collapse as a result of the fallout from Brexit. The Good Friday Agreement certainly wasn't perfect by any means, and the political situation is still strained. But it did do one thing. It stopped the violence. It stopped the no-warning bombs and the tit-for-tat killings which threw the country into chaos. It allowed children to grow up in a country where they could play in a street that wasn't patrolled by British Army vehicles and snipers. In 2007, Martin McGuinness became Deputy First Minister alongside the DUP's Ian Paisley, who was First Minister. The job is exactly the same, but the DUP argued that the larger party would hold the title of First Minister and the smaller be Deputy First Minister. As of writing in 2025, Sinn Féin's Michelle O'Neill is the current First Minister, and the DUP's Emma Little-Pengali is its Deputy First Minister. In writing this episode, I found a lot of similarities between Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley. For most of their lives, both men had an unwavering tunnel vision in their aims. Paisley was the no man, who flat out refused to break bread with the Republicans. And though his actions encouraged his followers to enact violence, he considered himself a holy man who abhorred it. Throughout his life, he refused to engage with Republicans. He even left the Good Friday Agreement peace talks and protested outside them. But when he protested the talks, he wasn't drawing the massive crowds that he would have brought 20 years earlier. More people wanted peace. Martin McGuinness, on the other hand, was an unrepentant Republican. He refused to apologise for the IRA and spent most of his life believing that the only solution was a violent one. His later career was dogged by politicians and reporters trying to get him to say he regretted the actions of the IRA, but he never did. So to have two former mortal enemies, Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, working side by side as the leaders of Northern Ireland was quite an achievement. The media even dubbed them the nickname the Chuckle Brothers because of how well they got on. In one instance, McGuinness said to the press, quote, "Up until the 26th of March this year, Ian Paisley and I never had a conversation about anything, not even about the weather. And now we have worked very closely together over the last 7 months, and there's been no angry words between us. This shows that we are set for a new course. At 81, Paisley was coming to the end of his life, and there was a belief that he had softened in his older age. Paisley passed away in 2014 at the age of 88. In 2011, Martin McGuinness ran for presidency in the Republic of Ireland. He was unsuccessful in his bid, losing out to Michael D. Higgins, and he came third, receiving around 250,000 votes from the people of Ireland. The sticking point in most of the debates were his ties to the IRA and his claim that he left them in 1974. There was one moment on the campaign trail where McGuinness was publicly confronted by the son of Patrick Kelly, who was shot dead by the IRA while trying to rescue the kidnapped businessman Don Tidy in 1983. His son David called Martin a liar, saying he knew the names of the men who killed his father and refused to say them. McGuinness and others in Sinn Féin wanted the public to remember the peace process and all the good that was done, but it was hard to forget the scars of the Troubles and the many unsolved killings or bodies buried that have never been recovered. In 2012, Martin McGuinness shook hands with Queen Elizabeth II, which was a historic moment and a kind of final act of reconciliation between the two. In 2017, Martin McGuinness resigned from his position as Deputy First Minister over a scandal involving the DUP's Arlene Foster. He was also gravely ill at the time, suffering from a mysterious illness known as amyloidosis. Martin McGuinness died on March 21st, 2017, at the age of 66. The Irish broadcaster RTE wrote that he will be remembered as one of the most influential Irish politicians of modern times. To many, Martin McGuinness was a man of violence, but to his family, he was a loving family man who doted over his grandchildren. He talked about football and loved going fly fishing for trout, and he was beloved by many nationalists around Ireland. Thousands of people lined the streets of the Bogside in Derry to attend his funeral, including Northern Irish politicians, Irish presidents and Taoiseachs, and former US President Bill Clinton. Clinton thanked the DUP's Arlene Foster for attending the funeral, and joked that Martin McGuinness was married to Gerry Adams almost as long as he was to his wife Bernie. Here's Gerry Adams speaking at his funeral.
This week, Ireland lost a hero. Derry lost a son. Sinn Féin lost a leader. And I lost a dear friend and a comrade. But Martin's family has suffered the biggest loss of all. They have lost a loving, caring, dedicated husband, father and grandfather, a brother and an uncle. So on behalf of Sinn Féin, on my own behalf, and on Clet's behalf, and on behalf of our family, and on all of your behalfs, I extend our solidarity to all of the McGuinness clan. You would not be surprised at some of the commentary from some quarters recently about him and his life. You could be the first to say that these people are entitled to their opinions, particularly those who suffered at the hands of the IRA. But let me take issue with those in the editorial rooms or in the political ivory towers who denounce Martin McGuinness as a terrorist. Mar a dúirt an Pearshock at the grave of another Fenian. The fools, the fools, the fools. Martin cannot answer them back, so let me answer for him. Martin McGuinness was not a terrorist. Martin McGuinness was a freedom fighter. And reading and watching some of the media reports of his life and death in recent times, one could be forgiven for believing that Martin, at some undefined point in his life, had a road to Damascus conversion, that he abandoned his Republican principles, that he abandoned his former comrades in the Irish Republican Army, and that he joined the political establishment. And to suggest this is to miss the truth of his leadership and the essence of his humanity. There was not a bad Martin McGuinness, or indeed a good Martin McGuinness. There was simply a man like every other decent man or woman doing their best in very difficult circumstances. Martin believed in freedom. He believed in equality. And he resisted, by armed actions, those who withheld these rights, and any help to shape conditions in which it was possible to advocate for these entitlements by unarmed strategies. And throughout it all, Martin remained committed to the same ideals that led to him becoming a Republican activist in the first instance.
There really is no way you can tell the story of Martin McGuinness without more or less telling the entire story of the Troubles, as he was probably the most instrumental person involved. When he saw people in his community getting killed, he stepped up and decided to fight back. He was indeed ruthless, a hard man who helped to bring the full might of the Provisional IRA down on the British Army and security services, which resulted in a devastating death toll. There are many coffins which were carried on the shoulders of Martin McGuinness, and even more graves dug as a result of his actions. But as much as he was instrumental in bringing about the violence, he was equally as important in bringing about the peace. Senator George Mitchell, who chairs the peace talks, said of McGuinness, quote, "There are occasions in human history where men and women rise to the occasion. Ordinary men and women rise above their backgrounds, above their conflicts, and with enormous courage and vision, take steps which change the course of history. And I think his ability to put his full skill and effort first into conflict, then into negotiation, then into governance, which is what made him unique." That's it from me. Thanks, and see you next time.